of the most common arguments that Christians bring up when attempting to share their faith with the Jewish people is the idea that you don't need to try to earn your salvation and God's forgiveness by works of the law, by keeping the law, the Torah. Christ fulfilled all of it, so you don't have to do it anymore. There are several problems with this line of reasoning. Number one, when interacting with Jews in 2022 or period, in any time period, it's not very reasonable to try to relate to the Jewish people based on what you think you understand from texts written around 2,000 years ago. I mean, imagine it. It's as if, like, Muslims would try to relate to you, a Christian, using texts that were written around 1,500 years ago. And how does that usually work out? How accurate are their perceptions of Christians? Think about it. But beyond that is the fact that, well, for one, the majority of Jews today aren't really that observant. Not only not that observant, but the majority of Jews today don't necessarily even believe in the Bible at all. Not just the New Testament, but don't really believe in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or the Law of Moses. Now, they may value it as a part of their cultural heritage, and they may believe in it as a historical record to some degree. But the majority of them feel less obligated in the Law of Moses than even Christians do. So it's kind of funny to begin the discussion with a Jew who you don't even know, based on the assumption that he thinks he has to earn his salvation and earn his forgiveness from God by keeping the Torah. It's simply not the case. And really, this isn't even the case with religious Jews, with Torah observant Jews, who daily declare in their prayers that our righteousness is nothing. So not for our righteousness, God have mercy on us, but for your name's sake, because of your righteousness and your kindness and your mercy. This is something that Jews declare every single day. The religious Jews who do keep the Torah. Now on to the concept of Christ keeping the Torah, and therefore we don't have to. Christ keeping the law, and therefore Jews don't have to. Number one, even if this were true, it's not a very reasonable or effective way of proving a concept when you try to prove a concept by using proofs that only one person in the conversation considers proof. In other words, why are you going to try to use quotes from the New Testament as proof for your arguments when the person you're trying to prove it to aren't convinced that these are proofs? They're not convinced of the New Testament. So how effective is quoting the New Testament going to be? If it's a Jewish person who believes in the Hebrew Bible, believes in the Torah, then you need to prove your concepts using the Torah, using the Hebrew Bible, things that they believe. And bear in mind, they will believe it in the Hebrew language. May not necessarily correlate to whatever one of the hundreds of translations you happen to be preferring. You need to study the Hebrew. You need to see if the translation you're using is accurate, or if perhaps the verse you're basing a certain argument on is potentially able to be translated in more than one way with more than one connotation or implication. It's not as simple as you might think it would be. And it's something that actually may refine your Christian faith. You may find much more depth in a certain concept and learn things you didn't expect to learn if you try to see how you can get from point A to point B. How it's possible to get from the teaching in the Torah or in the Hebrew Bible to the teaching that you think is taught in the New Testament. It may be that some of these teachings are able to be found from point A to point B, and it may be that some of these teachings really are a leap of logic and have no basis in the Hebrew Bible. But you have to do the research to find out for yourself, especially before trying to convince someone who might be able to study the Bible in the original language when you're not able to. And then you come to them as if you know more than them. It's not a very good approach. How effective is it when a Muslim tries to convert you, a Christian, by relying on proofs from the Quran which you don't even believe in? If he wants to try to prove something to you as a Christian, he's going to need to rely on the Bible, on the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. Trying to prove his faith to a Christian by quoting hadith or the Quran, something that you don't believe in, is just ridiculous. Think about it. Now, lastly, the concept of Christ or the Messiah fulfilling the Torah, fulfilling the law, and that somehow this means that therefore Jews don't need to keep the Torah. And also, when discussing this, keep in mind when discussing Jews keeping the Torah, we're not talking about keeping the Torah in order to be saved, in order to earn eternal life, but rather as an act of obedience, because we love God, as it says somewhere in one of the epistles of John, this is the love of God, to keep his commandments. Bear in mind, when Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, don't think I came to abolish, to nullify, to make no longer applicable the Torah and the prophets. I have not come to nullify, but to fulfill. That word fulfill can also be translated as accomplish, to do, to actualize, to make it reality. The exact opposite of the way that many Christians use the term fulfill, with the implication of no longer applicable, no longer supposed to be actually done. And ask yourself, what husband, when he fulfills his wedding vows and his promises to his bride, does his fulfilling those vows suddenly mean that he's no longer obligated to fulfill his promises? Does a groom, a husband, fulfilling his wedding vows to his wife mean that he's no longer obligated to fulfill his marital obligations? That doesn't make any sense. And it's quite clear that it doesn't make sense in the context of Jesus and the New Testament relative to the Torah, the law of Moses, because immediately after, just in case someone might misunderstand what Jesus meant when he said, don't think I came to nullify the Torah or the prophets. I didn't come to nullify, but to actualize, to do. In case they misunderstood what he meant and may think that by fulfill he meant don't ever do, which would be a contradiction, an immediate contradiction of his words. He continued his words with Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. Just keep reading a few verses. And he says, therefore, for this reason, whoever nullifies or cancels even the least of these commandments, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, whoever does and teaches these commandments. What commandments could he possibly be referring to? Well, he just mentioned the Torah and the prophets. What other commandments? Jesus did not teach that the Torah, the law of Moses, is done away with, no longer applicable. And I'm not just talking about the 10 Commandments. There is no basis. There are, I think, like 1 or 2 interpolations into the New Testament that are pretty clearly interpolations. Words, like a short phrase that was inserted into the original text by later editors that imply such a concept. And most translations actually put these in parentheses because it's so obvious that this is not the words of Jesus. In fact, if you look in red letter Bibles where they highlight the words of Jesus in red, those few places are not in red. because it's just so freaking obvious that Jesus didn't say that. And even if translators didn't make it clear to the careful reader that those particular places where it looks like Jesus may be saying a certain law is done away with, even if they hadn't made that about as clear as they could possibly make it clear that he didn't actually say that for the careful reader, well, you should at least notice that when Timothy in the book of Acts is accused of teaching against the Torah before they stoned him to death, you should be able to notice that the book of Acts calls that accusation a false testimony, a false witness. And now modern Christianity, well, it's not just modern Christianity. Modern Christianity just simply inherited this lie. But Christianity has been teaching this false witness, the reason that they unjustly murdered Stephen. They've been teaching this as the teachings of Stephen. And it doesn't stop with Stephen, whom many think was the first martyr of the disciples of Jesus. In Acts chapter 21, it says that when Paul came to Jerusalem, the first thing mentioned, the apostles, the first thing they mention to Paul, they bring up the fact that there are tens of thousands of Jews who have believed in the gospel, and they're all still keeping the law. Not only are they still keeping the Torah, but they're zealous for the Torah now as believers. They're extra passionate about it. The exact opposite of what Christianity has been teaching. And furthermore, they bring up to Paul some rumors that they had been hearing, that Paul is teaching the Jews among the nations, among the Gentiles, to abandon the Torah, to stop keeping the law of Moses, and to stop circumcising their children. Sound familiar? And in the book of Acts chapter 21, the same chapter, they explicitly state this was a false witness against Paul. So either Christians and translators are misunderstanding the words of Paul in his epistles and his letters in the New Testament. Either everybody's misunderstanding his letters, or someone's doing some mistranslating, or people are not reading these epistles, these letters of Paul, very carefully, or these letters simply are not really from Paul. Maybe they are counterfeit. Or perhaps Paul was deceptive and a liar. You got to decide on one of these. Personally, I think that it's more the former, that Paul didn't teach against the Torah that Jews should stop keeping the Torah, but that his target audience, as is quite clear in his letters, are not Jews, but non-Jewish believers among the nations. He was not teaching the Jewish people to abandon the Torah and stop keeping the Torah and stop circumcising. He was writing against non-Jews feeling obligated that they have to keep the Torah, have to keep the law of Moses in order to have forgiveness of sins. And he was teaching that if you start keeping these laws, the law of Moses, in order to earn your salvation, then you've made the death of Jesus meaningless. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be keeping the Torah. He's saying don't keep the Torah in order to earn your salvation. Don't think that God has had grace on you because you're somehow able to earn it. That's a completely different idea. In order to disprove the false rumors, that's not my words, that's in the book of Acts chapter 21. In order to disprove these false rumors against Paul, the apostles in Jerusalem direct him that he take a vow which requires sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. This is after Paul is a believer in Jesus, after he was made an apostle unto the nations. He takes a vow in order to disprove this false rumor, which now all of Christianity spreads about Paul. And he goes and makes sacrifices in the temple. It's time to put this falsehood to rest. 2,000 years is long enough. And the more people have access to information nowadays, the more they're going to realize these holes in Christianity. It doesn't mean Christianity is full of lies. It doesn't mean everything is false in Christianity, but there are falsehoods. There are misunderstandings and ignorance. And when people see these things and then they encounter Christians who just aren't aware whatsoever because they go to church every Sunday, but they never read their Bibles, do they really want to join them, or are they going to go looking somewhere else where people are a little more educated about their faith, where things make a little more sense? So, yeah, consider these things before trying to turn Jews into Christians. First, make sure you understand your own faith before trying to pull out the speck in your neighbor's eye. Shalom uvracha. Peace and blessings upon you. God have compassion and mercy on us all. Yalla bye.